But now I'm going to get to our opening event. This is something new this year, an industry roundtable moderated by Jack Kopanski, managing editor of Pit Quarry magazine. And as I read our panelists off, feel free to come up and turn your mic on and have a seat on the stage. So our panel includes Kirk Farmer, the CEO of Farmer Companies, Scott Anderson, the Central Region President of Summit Materials, Ward Nye, the CEO of Martin Marietta, and of course our moderator is Jack Kopanski. Come on up, guys. Ann Noonan could not make it, so Scott is subbing in for Ann. We're going to have time. Yeah, please. We will have some time near the end of the panel for questions. If you have a question, come up here in this area. I'll have the microphone right here. Our panelists have traveled quite a long ways. We appreciate them being with us this morning. And so I know they've been waiting patiently, and you've been waiting patiently. So I'm going to turn it over to Jack Kopanski and get started. Jack, as soon as your microphone's ready, the show is yours.
Good morning. It's working. I just pushed the button around. Yep. There we go. Awesome.
Hello? We'll figure this out.
All right.
We can go back and forth.
There we go. So like Dan mentioned, my name is Jack Kopanski, managing editor of Pit Quarry. I'm thrilled to be able to share the stage with Scott, Ward, and Kirk here. I think there's going to be a lot of great input, hopefully that you guys all find valuable, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say and sharing what the last year's been like, what next year's looking like, and kind of everything in between. So as we, I think, get a mic situated. So just to kind of dive into it, kind of start with a little look forward, look back. For all of you, how would you characterize what 2022 was like for you, and what are your expectations looking ahead now with 2023 just a month away? Whoever
I'll go first.
Start. All right.
I would say 2022 we had a lot of promise, and we just could not get in front of the inflation. And I bet you everybody in this room would say the same thing. You know, we thought it was going to be a great year, and we just could not get in front of the runaway inflation. So that's how I would characterize it.
You know what, that's a good description. I mean, I would describe 2022 as ragingly okay. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that, it's fascinating. Our teams did so well. They operated the business extraordinarily safety numbers that were and remain at world-class levels, and that's something that's so important to us, and that defines a year. But what Kirk said is right. It was a tough year because we didn't think we would see a lot of flow-through this year from the IIJA. We didn't, so that wasn't a surprise. Housing came into the year pretty strong, and then we obviously saw housing shimmy. And it's interesting in our business, housing's a piece of what a lot of us do. It's not a huge piece of what a lot of us do. But I think people outside the industry who look at it and judge it think that a lot of our businesses are almost uniquely tied to housing, which actually we're not. But I think that makes it a bit of a challenge. And then non-res this year was just odd because you had people like Amazon saying, look, we're going to back off on some of what we're doing. But it's also odd that Amazon has built more warehousing in the last 5 years than Walmart has in the last 50. So obviously there's going to be some catch-up that others will see, but energy is going to be a different thing, I think, and hope next year than it's been. So you saw some aspects of this year that were some green shoots. You saw some other things pull back. And inflation was just real, and it was hard to stay ahead of it, and I think we all felt it.
Yeah, I don't think I would say a whole lot different there. I will tell you, when I took my first leadership position, my boss told me leadership is just dealing with problems and solving problems. And so I felt like 22 was a lot of leadership. And we had a lot of problems. And, inflation was a big one. Labor challenges were a big one. Supply constraints were, so we got hit with a lot. What's interesting, though, I was really actually proud of our teams. Like you said, it was okay. I think, Summit's going to come in. If they hit the midpoint of their guidance, they still get, mid-single-digit growth year over year. We were very busy. We fought a lot of challenges, but we still eked out some growth. So very proud of the team and how the agility they had to use to face and combat the issues in the market this year.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that to me has stood out most about the aggregate industry over this last year is that despite all these challenges, I know, Ward, your description was ragingly okay,
Yeah.
Which is a unique one. I haven't heard that one before. But even amidst all these challenges, there is still that growth, even if, even if it's tough to get on top of inflation, that there has been that success even in the face of everything that's going on. And in your words, the leadership, the problem-solving aspect. I think that speaks a lot to this industry, the fact that even with everything going on, that they were still able to be success and growth this year.
The part of what strikes me about this industry generally, and we were talking about this at breakfast, one, you look around this room, this is a group of people you want to spend time with. I mean, that's part of what I think attracts people to this industry. The other thing, to your point, this is such a durable business. It goes through cycles, and obviously we feel it to a degree, but we don't feel it in some respects to the degrees that other businesses do. When we think back to the Great Recession, the financial crisis, a lot of us saw volumes cut by 45, 50 or more %. But the fact is our businesses came through that. I mean, we didn't come through it unscathed, but we came through it. And even as we went into COVID, I mean, we go back in March of 2020 and the nation was wondering, where's this thing going? And our industry gets designated as essential, as we should have, and we just powered through. And again, I think the durability of this industry and the durability of the member companies who are here and the way that you lead your teams and the way that your businesses have come through has been extraordinary. And I think those are the stories that we need to start telling people, because one of the great challenges we have is getting people excited about coming to work in this industry. And it's such a great one. And when we tell the story, just as you did, I think we can bring people in for a career. But we need to be really focused on that, because a lot of people like me have white hair these days, and we just need to be thinking about it.
Warden, you hit on another one of the questions I wanted to get some thoughts from all you three on is the shortage of skilled labor, is the lack of availability in the workforce. And I'm curious, you hear people say, get out to the schools, get back into vocational programs, make it an interesting and a attractive career path for younger people and try to build that up from a younger age. But for you three, what are some of those steps that you think need to be taken to expand that availability of skilled labor in the workforce?
I'll tell you what, I'll take the first shot at that one. We'll work our way down. I think part of what we've done and done well is we partnered with some schools that have a unique emphasis in our space. And I think that helps. I think the other thing that we need to start thinking about, though, is where are the other places that we can go to with a very targeted approach and not send one person from human resources or otherwise. Go in with a team of people so you can really do something in an area, in a space that's going to be impactful, to have the dialogue that we're talking about. And I think if we're not highly intentional about what we're going to do, where we're going to go, why we're going to go there, who we're going to send, what we're going to arm them with, what is the story we're going to tell them, what's the compelling thing that brings this person in? Because here's my guess. You get the dialogue, you get them in your office, you're probably going to hire them. The trick is getting them to engage with you. Because if your experience is like mine, when I'm talking to young people who are in high school, a community college or a college, and they're not at Missouri Rama, or they're not at Colorado School of Mines, and you say, I'm in the aggregates business. They're glazed over a little bit. And then once you start saying, let me tell you why, and let me tell you why this is compelling, and let me share with you why this is not a job, but rather why this can be a career, it's a fundamentally different conversation. Because I believe if we can open that dialogue up in meaningful ways, and remember, you're only going to get a first chance to make that first impression. And again, being really purposeful about the who, the where, what they have, and how it's going to be structured. But I think if we're just shooting in the sky as birds go by, instead of picking exactly what we want to do, the results won't change markedly. And these are the conversations, at least, we're having inside Martin Marietta right now.
I think the conversations that we're having with our team are how to retain the younger workforce. You know, the older school generation can work, and they can do 20% overtime, and they will grit it out. And people that are in their 30s and their 20s, they burn out so fast when they have to do a little bit of overtime. So we're having those kinds of conversations as to how on earth we can keep those people, how we need to reach them and keep them engaged and want to do the work. The solutions are not easy, but those are the conversations. We see that gap, right, of our older workforce they're great. And we don't want to lose them, but they're going to age out eventually. And our younger people are just, it's really hard to find the farm kid or the kid that really wants to come to the mine or the ready mix plant or the paving crew or what have you that wants to put in the extra time for that money. And so that's where we're struggling. We don't have the solution. We think, you know, got to use a little bit of technology and what these kids want to see, you know, engage them a little bit more in that area. But, you know, we don't have the answer, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, I'll kind of piggyback on to Kirk's comment. I do think the market's helping us a little bit, Jack. I think pay rates are moving up. You know, my son made the comment the other day, he's a land manager for wildlife and parks, and he said, Dad, I should have been a heavy equipment operator. They're making good money, get to run equipment, and the equipment nowadays, it's pretty nice to run. But I don't think that message gets out. And so I think what Ward was saying, we got to be very targeted and get the message out and really focus on career development for these guys and show them that pathway to a career. Matter of fact, if Ann was here, our CEO, she'll tell you, she's working to create a path from a quarry to a CEO position in some materials, which is pretty exciting for the guys on the front line to be able to see that kind of a vision. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I think we definitely got a long ways to go, and it's a tough one to solve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Kirk, you brought up the idea of worker retention, which is something we've been hearing a lot about at Pit and Quarry as well, and obviously I'm sure you're all seeing firsthand. And like you said, there's really no one answer. There's no one thing or you can do to solve these problems. But I'm curious what some methods are that you're employing. Kirk, you mentioned technology a little bit. You know, Scott, I know you gave the example of saying you know, wanting to go into heavy machinery and work with all this equipment. So I'm curious what steps your companies are taking to try to retain not only the young, but, you know, the older and sort of middle age or middle of the road workforce, I should say, when it's so easy for people to kind of branch off and go somewhere else.
What are you doing, Scott?
Yeah, well, first of all, on the technology side, we're doing a lot more social media to attract talent, because that generation you're talking about, you've got to get out on social media. So we're doing a lot more of that. The other thing, we're looking into apps that have us more connectivity. You know, try to get connected, get that communication. Our employees want more communication. So we're looking at apps to make it more connected. And then the last piece I think we're doing is and I don't have a lot of details on it, but we just invested in what's called a learning management system to where we're able to offer our employees training online at flexible times during the day. Mm-hmm. And they can pick the course that they want to work on and just advance their careers, kind of put it in their own control. So that's something we're just kind of rolling out, but I'm kind of excited about it.
Mm-hmm. Part of what we're doing too is some of it's old school and some of it's not. I mean, we talk about some of what we've hit here today. We talk about what our values are. and why we think this is a good company, a safe company to invest a future in. We talk a lot about the fact that safety is a value in our company. The other thing that we've done, and this is really the old school piece of it, and it's worked well for us, and it's defied most of the conventional wisdom and logic of the way companies have approached this. We have a 401k for our employees. We also have a pension plan for employees. And there are very few companies left today that offer both. And part of what's made a real difference for us is 5 years after you've worked for Martin Marietta, you're vested in a pension plan. And this past year, for example, we upped the increase in the pension plan for our hourly employees. Because if you spend 25 or 30 years at Martin and you're an hourly employee, you can retire between your 401k, your pension, and Social Security, basically at full compensation. And you go back to the notion, so many young people, when they finish whatever level of education they're finishing today, they're finishing with this view that they might have a dozen to 15 different jobs during the course of a career. And that sounds fine until you realize that at the end of it, you're not going to have something that you can really pivot to and look at. And when we think about the fact that people today have to think about living into their 90s, I mean, this notion of retiring before it's 65 and then having whatever your golden years were for a few years, but now you're looking to have life expectancies in the 80s and 90s. How you think about that and how you help young people think about what their future is and why maybe a dozen jobs isn't as good an idea as you think it is, and what these things can do for you near term, and importantly, what they can do for you long term. And then you're back to the notion, so many young people coming into business today want to know, what are you doing for the broader society? And the fact is, what we do in this room is we build communities. There's absolutely, positively no heavy-side construction that occurs anywhere in the United States or world, period, full stop, without our products. And when people start thinking about that and the fundamental difference that we make, it suddenly starts putting them in a place that they think fundamentally differently about a role in a company like ours. So the way we communicate it, the benefits that we try to offer, and the dialogue that we share. And I think the other thing that we're trying to do better with our employees is making sure each year we're giving them something that they can look at that says, what am I building as I stay here, and what is this going to mean? Because it's one thing to hear it. It's another thing to get a mailing at home that your employee sees, and maybe more importantly, that their spouse sees as well. Because let's keep in mind, if you've got that connectivity there, you're actually winning twice.
I don't have much to add. I think Ward and Scott summed it up really well. But I think when we look at this kind of stuff, we're beginning to target that turnover that we see is largely in the first 6 months, and some of that's good turnover. Yeah. Some of it we need to keep, right? And so if we can get an employee to stick around for a year, the chances of retaining them are a lot higher. So, whatever tool or connected device you can reach them on, I think is pretty key in those first few months to make them feel like they're valued.
Absolutely.
One thing I'll tell you that I'd love to get your perspectives on it that I've seen that's very different. And it's happened pretty quickly. I mean, if we were talking and looking at an hourly workforce 10, 12, 15 years ago, the notion of having significant overtime was actually really appealing to the workforce then. If they weren't working 50, 55 hours a week, they weren't that happy about that because they had built a lifestyle based on degrees of overtime. And what's very different today, and I think you're right, I think some of it's generational, but on occasion we see it even going beyond a younger generation. They're really not looking for that overtime. I mean, they're looking for something that's much more identified during a relatively traditional work week. And the dilemma that we have in an outdoor sport, particularly in the summer months, is you're just after it in the summer months, and there's a lot of demand, and not at times a lot of season. But is that something you guys are seeing as well? Does that resonate?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's actually, Ward, you bring it up. It's interesting. We, with recession and uncertainty, we were looking at pulling back some of our hours. And our older workforce, you're right, they want that overtime. the younger workforce, they welcome that. And it's interesting, I was in Denver a couple of weeks ago, and Chick-fil-A, different industry, was advertising for a position that they had open, and they were changing the shift, and they said you only have to work 3 days a week for 12 hours a day. And they said they had one position open, they had 100 people lined up for that one position. It's interesting, the younger workforce, they're looking for, you know, a little different structure. So we're actually exploring some different structures and maybe longer days and like 3-day weekends and stuff like that. More flexibility for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Shifting gears a little bit now, I know sustainability has been a big buzzword and has been a large focus in the industry, you know, especially recently within the last few years. And, you know, I want to dive into a little bit of what that looks like for each of your operations. But just to kind of start, I know it can mean different things to different people, but for each of you, what does sustainability mean to Summit, to Martin Marietta, and to Farmer?
Let the publics go first. You guys got to go first.
Okay. I'll swing at that pitch. You know, it's odd because here's what I'll tell you. It's two very different conversations. If you're a publicly traded conversation, it's a conversation. If you're a closely held company, it's a conversation, but probably a different one. And so what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is if you saw the correspondence that I get every day on this, it would absolutely rock your world, because it does mine. I'm totally surprised by it. And what does that mean? It means if I get a letter in the mail and it's on A4 paper, so that longer paper, it's coming in from somebody in Europe who's a large shareholder who wants to have a meaningful ESG dialogue with us. So what are they wanting to know? They're wanting to know, how are we thinking about emissions? How are we thinking about water? What targets are we setting? Over what period of time are we going to set the targets? They're going to send us surveys that are massive surveys. That means that really you need to go and have a cottage industry somewhere in your company of people who are almost doing nothing except filling out surveys. And what you will come to the conclusion of after some of these conversations is you really want to ask someone, now it does matter to you that we make money, right? And sometimes it does, and sometimes it really doesn't. What's surprising on this to a degree, and when we have the dialogue, people are comforted by it, the stone business is actually a very good, clean business. Think of it in these terms. What's our primary pollutant? Our primary pollutant is dust. How do we typically fight dust? We typically fight dust with high-pressure water sprays. What do we do in our operations? We have closed-loop systems. We end up recirculating the water. And if and when we have a discharge, you're discharging either pursuant to an NPDES permit or a SPEDIES permit, and typically you're discharging something into a stream, river, tributary, or something that's relatively drinking water quality. When we have that conversation, say, actually, from an environmental perspective, you would rather live next door to a quarry in most instances than you would to agricultural activities in most instances. Suddenly you've changed the scheme of the conversation pretty quickly. But if you're a public company, part of what's happening today is the SEC is looking at basically changing the way that you publicly report on what you're doing from an environmental perspective. So if you think about it this way, every quarter I sign my life away. And what I mean by that is I'm certifying what our financials are, and I'm certifying what our control environment looks like. And I do it with very high penalties that come associated with it if I'm wrong. Now, what the SEC would like to do is take the reporting that we've traditionally done and the metrics that have traditionally been there relative to financials and make them applicable to what's happening with a number of these environmental issues. What's strikingly different about that is in Europe, they've long been reporting on these metrics in ways that we haven't in the United States, but they do it typically in a sustainability report. And we issue a sustainability report today as well. The difference is the rigor and the penalties associated with the sustainability report, and the rigor and penalties associated with an SEC filing are two very different things. So, and that's why I say you've got varying degrees of different conversation, because you have these large fund owners who are very interested in this topic. It's more socially driven at times than it is science driven. And you do feel like, look, we all live in this world, we want clean air, we want clean water, but you can't help but feel on occasion there's some agendas at work here, because you just try to be really clear-eyed and transparent about what you're navigating. But you've also got certain proxy advisory firms that give advice to these big public entities that buy shares in a Summit or Martin Marietta, and they can control 30-ish% of the vote that comes in at a proxy at the end of the season. And so my point with this is, you read about this, you hear about it, and it's easy to look at it in some respects and say this feels extreme, and in some respects it does. At the same time, if you're a public company and your owners are really knocking hard on the door, and then you have governance that's putting some real teeth and real penalties to the way this works, it does have your full attention. And it's so easy not to see how that ticks and ties. I'm sorry I went on a bit about it.
I just wonder at what point that becomes really unproductive. Because I don't spend any of my time on that, and you've got to spend a lot of your time on that. So it amazes me how much time a productive person like yourself has to spend
on that. Yeah, it's a great question, and you know what, honestly, I'm not sure when we reached the stage, but we're there. I mean, there's no doubt that we're there, because it does take a lot of time. And actually, to my point earlier, I do think as an industry, we're actually very good at it. This goes back to at least part of the same dialogue we were having on employees, and that is, if we tell our story well, we're going to be fine as we come through this. We also have to stay close to those who regulate our industry as well, to make sure that they're understanding what we do and why. Because coal and aggregates are not the same thing. You know, if you think about industrial diseases and what they see in other industries, but most importantly, what we don't see in ours. And let's be honest, we've got a much better control environment today than we did 25 and 30 years ago. Is it unproductive? Some of it is. Is it trending toward a higher degree of unproductivity? Probably so in the near term. I hope we can have some degree of common sense that can come and measure some of this, but it's going to be a big deal. And it's going to be a big deal for a while. And when people are talking to you in your organizations and you're pulling together information, at times you're wondering, good heavens, why? You know, these are some of the reasons why. So, but I'm sure you're seeing it at Summit too, day in, day out.
Yeah, and I will tell you, it is a big deal, Ward, to us. And if you look at Summit Materials and you look at their vision, we aim to be the most socially responsible, vertically integrated construction materials company. So, I mean, we have set ourselves, you know, an aim to be very socially responsible. In my region, you know, we've taken an approach that we really want to focus in on land reclamation, land in use. We really feel like we have a responsibility to return that land better than we left, or better than when we found it. And so the guys have done a great job. We've got a lot of awards for reclamation projects. I love it when we take an old quarry and we turn it into a wildlife habitat site. Or we take an underground mine and we turn it into a storage facility, a very active storage facility. There's other things we're looking at. We're looking at turning sites into parks, dog parks, pollinator gardens, solar fields. Just really trying to see what are good development uses for the land, and really getting into our communities and seeing what they need, what they want, and trying to be a good partner and a sustainable partner on the land side of it. Now, you know, Ward definitely covered the governance piece, and we have that as well at the CEO level especially, a lot of responsibility around that. A lot of investors are looking for us to really participate and reduce our emissions. So we're looking at that as well. We've actually equipped all of our vehicles with tracking systems so we can track the emissions of every one of our vehicles and really engage our employees to take part in this and take responsibility and help us reduce fuel, and emissions. The other thing we're looking at is alternative fuels, and at some of our sites, we're going in and switching from generator power to line power. Anything we can do to get to more renewable sources, and keep in mind the economic impact of it, Kirk. We're doing that as well.
I think, sustainability takes on a completely different meaning as a private company compared to a public company that has that sort of outsider ownership pressure. I would say most of the people in this room that work for private companies don't share that same need or desire. When I think of sustainability, I think of having a really strong balance sheet and having a company that's sustainable, that can last generations. And obviously what Ward said is true. We're really not that dirty of an industry, and we are building communities. So as long as we're focused on that, we are being sustainable. So, I focus more on the economics of being sustainable than the environmental side, because I do think the environmental side does take care of itself.
Right. Absolutely. So kind of maybe in that sense, maybe a question for Scott and Ward. With sustainability not obviously being limited to the aggregate industry, become more of a, I don't know if worldwide is the right term to use, but a larger picture thing. You mentioned land reclamation, all the different ways that you're able to, turn the land into something new, leave it better than you found it in a sense. Ward, you mentioned a lot of the governance side of things. How do you feel the aggregate industry fits into the overall sustainability picture, and do you think the industry is a leader in that larger sustainability picture, and if not, do you think it should be?
I think it will be. I think it is. I think it's more of a leader in it than again, we tell the story of. If we think about sustainable construction and coastal areas of the United States and how structures have to be built and the use of concrete and the way that we can have homes withstand significant storms and come through cycles that are so important, the role that we're going to have as an industry in that is going to be disproportionate. And we need to be able to tell that story. I think the other thing that we can do over time, and we're seeing that now, is not just thinking about what our emissions look like, but how our power sources are used as well. I mean, for example, we have cement operations in North Texas, and we actually use alternative energy at one of those. We burn over 10 million tires a year at our Midlothian cement plant. And think about what that means. It means tires are coming in to that plant. We actually get paid a tipping fee to take millions of tires a year that aren't going to a landfill. We'll shred those tires, we'll pull the steel out of it, we'll recycle the steel. We'll actually get paid for the recycle, we get paid for the tires, and we burn the tires at a very high temperature, and that's 40% of the power to turn that kiln. Okay, think about the story that I've just said, right? One, that's millions of tires a year that aren't going to a landfill. Okay, that's a good sustainable story. Two, 40% of the energy is suddenly coming from that. And three, we're partnering with people who are looking at degrees of control technology that can capture more greenhouse gases that typically go out of a cement kiln. And at the same time, we're looking at now what a lot of you know as PLC cement or Portland limestone cement or type 1L that basically can take, it's a degree of limestone substitution for clinker. It gives you about 10 to 15% more capacity, less GHGs. So if we suddenly start stepping back away from that and saying how much has just that narrow piece of our business changed over a 5-year period, that's a pretty impactful story. You take a story like that and transcend it across a country, or to your point, transcend it across a globe, suddenly you've got a very powerful story. The other thing that I think is worth noting is if we look at the way cement is manufactured in the U.S. and the way that we keep score on some of that using EPA data and the way European players look at it. You're not always talking an apples to apples comparison. So it's important that as we tell our story in the United States and become that leader that you're referencing, that we remember we are telling a global story within a national footprint because so many people around the world are investing in our businesses here.
Yeah, Jack, I have to go along with that pretty well. I think we are going to be, I think we need to be a leader. And I think we have an obligation. Again, I think the land piece is very important, that we look for opportunities on these land projects. But the emissions, that's a huge area. And I think we've already kind of taken the first step by really starting to measure where we're at, what is our usage levels, and then starting to look for, like Ward said, the alternative fuels. And I think we're going to have to explore into electrics. I mean, we're already using hybrid loaders, and they work fine. So I think we're going to continue to expand into those areas. And when the electric fleets start coming out, I think we're going to have to look at that. So yeah, the other part is I do think you got to continue to partner and be involved in your communities. And whether it's the recycling and just the good neighbor type activities, I think we got to, as an industry, stay connected and involved in those.
Yeah.
The only last thing I would add is I think associations like the MLPA need to step up, continue to step up. I think this is a great association, and pound the table there legislatively and from a marketing perspective, basically. That's the other area that I would say, other than CEOs like Ward being able to say what he says. That's the way I see this industry leading.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you just hit on the idea of getting out in the community, and I know, Ward, you've talked about telling stories and really educating the public about what it is this industry does, and I know there's sort of this lingering perception of what a quarry is and what it brings about and living near it, but I'm curious, in recent years, is that a perception or a sort of a stereotype and thought that you've seen change, and has that been something that you as companies have been making an effort to, again, get involved with the public, with your surrounding neighborhoods, and kind of say, hey, this is what's really happening. I know what you may think, but this is what's really going on. Is that something you've seen kind of change or put an emphasis on?
I will say, Jack, that social media has kind of changed it for us. Mm-hmm. It's amazing how these myths can go out there about a quarry when you're getting ready to do a permit or a renewal. So we have to be very actively involved and engaged with our community leaders and dispelling those kind of myths and showing them, what the real quarry is. And like Ward said, it's a clean industry. And one thing we've done that's really helped us too is we've connected with our schools. I can't tell you how many field trips we have to the quarries. And having those kids, and the one that gets to push the button for the shot and shoot a shot, man, those things are really special. And I feel like that's pretty impactful in our communities, that we get to educate the younger. That'll also help workforce development too. But on a side, we're just very engaged in our community, and I think you've got to be in that constant communication with your leadership in your communities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the school piece of that is so huge. And the other thing that I would say, and it's been odd, and if we go back to it and think of it in these terms, the last few economic cycles that have worked well have been odd in the United States. And here's what I mean by that. They've not been building lead. I mean, think about this. The fact, if we go back to 2005, 2006, the true peak of the last cycle, housing starts in the U.S. were over 2 million starts. That was a high number. That was an unsustainable number. If we look at housing starts over the last 50 years on average, they've been at 1.5 million. If we look at housing starts over the last few years, they've been at about 1.3 million. And we've got a country that has 30 million more people in it now than it did 25 years ago. So we've seen several cycles, but they've not been construction-led. And my point with that is as follows. We're in an industry that's actually not running at capacity. We're actually running in the aggregate industry below capacity. And the reason I think that's important is, with the exception of permit renewals, we haven't really, as an industry, been opening a lot of greenfield sites because we haven't needed to, as a practical matter. And what that means is, kids come through, we show them quarries, but as a practical matter, we haven't been taking a lot of city councils, county commissions, and others through. And at least in my history, when we take them through, or a member of Congress or somebody else, they're almost always surprised. Because what they think they're going to see and what they see end up being two very different things. Let's think about practically what we do. We put together land, we put together a quarry, we put berms around it, we usually put trees up, we oftentimes put gates across. And sometimes if you're driving by, it can look like a subdivision. It doesn't look like an industrial use. But somebody has in their mind what they think this industrial use looks like back there. My experience almost uniformly, when we bring a county commissioner or a congressman or somebody in, show them the site, drive them in the pit, show them the stockpiles, introduce them to our workforce, and show them a shot, which is usually the highlight of anybody's visit. You know what their comment usually is after a shot? Is that it? And what a wonderful comment to have, because suddenly they're recognizing we drill, we blast. The blasts are going in from end to end. It's canceling out vibrations. We're blasting with the weather. We're blasting with the time of day. These are very sophisticated operations. This is not Fred Flintstone's business in any respect. And again, I think it goes back to what we said. If we can start with young people and have that work well and stay really engaged, we need to do it. If we can have educators involved, we need to have that done. But the more that we can bring the regulators and the people in your community who are elected in office to see what you're doing, the more important that's going to be. And the fact is, we have worked so hard to be forgotten. I mean, let's face it, the best thing that we can do is have people drive by our quarry and not know that we're there. That has been indicating to us over the last few years that somehow we're winning. And to the degree that we're not having a negative impact on a community, we are. What we're not doing is we're not underscoring the positive impact we have on a community and the true sensitivity of our operations to the way our neighbors live, work, and otherwise. So I think the extent to which we can have that public engagement at a much higher level and recognize that while we're not in a huge permitting expansion mode right now, being, again, purposeful, just like we are in employees, bringing them in, being purposeful with our regulators or elected officials and bringing them in is hugely important.
It's been said well.
Yeah, absolutely. Slightly shifting gears again, we hit on it, I think, briefly a little earlier in our talk, but it's been over a year now since the IIJA passed. I know there's funds waiting to be dispersed. There's funds that have been dispersed. So I'm just curious with, again, 2023 just a month away now, I'm curious what your thoughts are on what next year might look like if and when those funds start getting dispersed on, hopefully, a wider scale.
I'll go first. Missouri has had an about face, so I think all of us in the room know that. The Department of Transportation seems to be much more well-funded than the fear we've been living in over the past 20 years. We welcome it. I think the aggregate industry is going to hold up just fine in whatever recession that we have. I would say, in other lines of business, maybe not quite as well. I think ready mix will go down, which is, I think, more tied to residential. But in general, I think the aggregate business should be just fine.
I totally agree with that. It's interesting to look back at what this highway bill is going to mean. Because if we look at the increase in funding that comes with this, it's the single largest increase that we've seen since Eisenhower signed the National Interstate Act into law in the mid-1950s. So as Ron Burgundy would say, it's a big deal. So we start with that notion. If we go from there and take a look at what obligations were for next year through the first 8 months of this year, they were at 28%. So those are good ARPA numbers if you just want to know how they're trending. As a practical matter, if we go back to history and take a look at the way those funds usually flow, really, I'm going to view next year as year one, because while it was signed last November, I don't think any of us were under any misapprehension that we were going to see much help from that this year. And by the way, we were not disappointed by that, right? So as a practical matter, probably about 20% of those funds start rolling through in a meaningful way next year. I think probably about 40% start rolling through in a meaningful way in 24. So if you think about what that's going to be, it's going to be a nice, consistent build over a period of years, and then it's going to do one of these things, which is typically the way that it works. But remember what we're coming into, and this is what's so fundamentally different. So we've always had good, steady highway bills, right? The United States has usually invested in highways, bridges, roads, and streets pretty responsibly, and we've done so in defense responsibly. Somewhere in there we lost religion relative to highways, bridges, roads, and streets. And what happened was we had the Great Recession. So we had the Great Recession, the highway bill that we had ended, and we ended up with a decade of continuing resolutions. And it might have lasted 30 days, it might have lasted 3 months. But in any event, if a state DOT is looking to the federal government to be their partner, and you've got a short-term CR, it puts you in maintenance and repair land for an extended period of time. And that's where the United States was. And then even when we had the FAST Act, I mean, let's be clear what we got with the FAST Act. Not that much more money, but we got more time. So this time, we have time and we have money. And in many respects, we have state DOTs that are well-funded. That's a fundamentally different place than we've been for a long time. So I agree with what we've heard. I think public construction is going to be good, and it's likely going to be good for a number of years. Do I think we're likely to see a pullback in degrees of private, more particularly in the near term on single-family res? Yeah, I think so. But I think if we think about what this bill is going to mean for Missouri, what it's going to mean for the nation, it's going to put contractors in a position that they can invest in people, can invest in their business, and actually plan for multiple years. And we have not been there as an industry for almost 15 years. And it's easy to forget how long and difficult that journey has been. But we're in a special moment right now. And we need to make sure that when we're talking to our legislators, both here and in Washington, we're getting those funds out. Because the buoyancy of the contracting community in Missouri is important to this state, and it's important to the Department of Transportation here for your quality of life, for your competitiveness. So do I think we're in a good place? I do. Do I think the funds will flow through well? I actually do. Do I think DOTs are in a better position to deploy them? I think that as well. So I like where we're sitting right now as an industry. I haven't seen it look this good in that sector in a long, long time.
Yeah, just I'm likewise. I'm excited about what's going on the public side. You know, you talked about the federal infrastructure. We're definitely going to see a step up in 23. I think you get a layering effect, and you even get another step up in 24, just like Ward said. But behind that, the state DOTs, they're very healthy. The state budgets are very healthy. You know, when unemployment's low and property tax or property values are high, and sales tax is going, spending's out there, these states are collecting high tax revenues. And so their budgets are very healthy right now. Matter of fact, in Kansas, where I live, they've got the largest cash balance they've had in their history, over $1 billion in reserve. So it's really setting the stage up for, you know, the needed infrastructure that we see that we need in these communities. So I'm pretty excited about where we sit. And you know, Ward, you said early on we're a durable industry, and I think this is really going to come through. Obviously, the residential, we're going to probably see some pullback there, but the public just looks really optimistic for us.
Excellent, excellent. Kind of shifting again to the topic of safety. I know, Ward, you mentioned a lot of the stuff that is going on with Martin Marietta and how excited you seemed about the steps the company is taking from a safety perspective. I'd just kind of like to hear from all of you, you know, where that kind of sits with each of your companies, how you're keeping safety front of mind, and just kind of how you're adapting and navigating that.
Take a stab at it. You know, we made a decision as a family to kind of put our money where our mouth was with safety before I started. It was my dad and my uncle, and so we take our losses. And when somebody gets hurt, we pay for it. And so it became pretty important to us to keep our people safe. And I think we do a pretty good job at it. Our EMR is about as low as it gets, 0.5. So it's very strong. Our losses are low, but you got to incent the employees to be safe, and you got to preach it every day. Sometimes you got to stop doing what you're doing and just talk about safety. That's what we do.
And we do the same thing. Your most efficient way to find your way out of Martin Marietta is to violate one of two things: violate our code of professional business conduct, or violate our safety rules. That's your quickest way out of the company. And we don't do that as a stick. We do that because we have a guardian angel program that says we're going to take care of each other in the workplace. And what does that mean at the end of the day? It means we're driving toward changing people's behaviors. What we recognize is once you have an incident, the matter of severity becomes a matter of luck. And that's what's so discerning about it. So our view is we're going to look for world-class safety metrics. We are going to train people. We're going to talk about it incessantly. But it's more than just talk. It really is something that means something to us. If you read our press releases, if you listen to my prepared remarks on earnings calls, typically one of the first things we talk about is what our safety numbers look like, because we want to make sure our investors understand that and that our employees understand that. So what are we doing? We're looking at total case incident rates that need to be below 0.9. We view 0.9 as a world-class threshold. What are we looking at on lost time? Lost time that's below 0.2. If we look across the organization for the last 2 years, we've long had lost time rates that have been better than world-class levels. We've only recently gotten total case numbers at world-class levels. And a lot of that's because we've been a very acquisitive company over time. So what we've found is typically when we do an acquisition, we need to make sure the business that we just bought takes a philosophy that puts it into what we're doing that looks like we do in Heritage Martin Marietta. So typically, we see incident rates cut in half within the first 6 months to a year after an acquisition. What are we also looking at? Citations per inspection, citations per day. So let's face it, MSHA's going to show up. You've got your 2s and your 4s. So part of what we're doing is we're trying to make sure that we're not giving them excuses to write paper when they come through. So we have internal teams that are going through and doing our own safety inspections as well. And part of the trick that we're doing is going into our downstream operations as well that are OSHA governed, not MSHA governed, because let's face it, OSHA is going to show up when something really bad happens. I mean, MSHA is going to show up 2 and 4 times a year by statute. OSHA is going to be there when you have a oh gosh moment. So part of what we're trying to do is bring the rigor that we would typically have in a mine operation because of what's happening under the Mine Act and make sure that's happening in the downstream businesses as well. And what we've seen is that's actually flown through and it's really mattered. The other thing that we're doing is we're having people give safety observations at quarries. And by the way, the beauty is if they see a photograph or me at an operation, I have gotten phone calls in my office and somebody says, you know, Ward, I've got a safety observation for you. And I think that's one of the greatest calls I can ever get. So the fact is, this is something that is of value for us. We make it a big deal. We talk about it publicly. We talk about it privately in the operations. There's not a meeting that starts in our company that doesn't begin with safety first, and that includes a board of directors meeting.
I'll just pick up where Ward left off. Safety is a core value for us, and there's not a meeting that starts without starting with safety. We do the same thing. We start it with a safety share and really set the tone. We want to keep safety front of mind. We've got a number of programs on safety. We're measuring everything, and we're really trying to drive it down to the front line. And when you look at our metrics, our recordable rate from last year has dropped 50%. So I know we're making an impact. We're really trying to empower that frontline guy to say, raise his hand and say, you know what, this is not safe. And make sure that we have that culture where those guys are empowered to do that right on the front lines. I do want to say on the MSHA inspections, that's something that we see as a really indicator of how well, you know, how do you got good housekeeping? Is your site in order? Are you really looking after things? So we measure the MSHA inspections and we look after that pretty close. And it's interesting, just last quarter in my region is just Kansas and Missouri, all the sites in Kansas and Missouri. We had, in last quarter, just 3-month period, we had 36 zero citation inspections across our sites. So I get that, it wasn't that many years ago where you'd have 4 or 5 maybe zeros a year. And now we're getting 36 in just a quarter. I'm pretty excited about where our guys are taking this on the safety front. It's the most important. There's a saying we have around our culture here that we're going after zero harm. We want everybody to go home safe at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. With that safety first mindset, and I know that's something a lot, if not hopefully every company in the industry shares, there's still in the last year to couple years has been an uptick in minor fatalities, and I'm curious that even with that emphasis on safety that so many companies have, I'm curious where you think the aggregate industry as a whole is from a safety standpoint, given where fatality numbers are.
I'll go first because you guys have been really taking the lead. I will say that I think the turnover, has definitely, I think it's probably an impact. There's no doubt that data suggests that, your less seasoned employees, your new employees are subject to more risk. And so I think it's a responsibility that we need to take on is to have a really strong new hire training program. Really make sure it's not just setting them in front of a video for a few hours. We got to have hands-on training, task training, equipment training, risk assessments, and really thoughtful training for our new hires. The other piece I think sometimes we forget too is our more seasoned employees, the ones with over 5 years experience, sometimes they have a tendency to get complacent and maybe lose that awareness. And so I think we got to energize that as well, but really focused in on the new hires would be my recommendation.
And that's such a great thought. And the new hires is where the greatest peril is. Having safety mentors, having people who have worked safely for years, who you will identify, and we do it in our company, even with different hard hat colors. So if you're a new miner, you're going to have one hard hat color. If you're a safety mentor, another one. If you've been there after a New Year policy or time period, yet another. So you can identify people who are new visually and very quickly. You can also identify the people who can help guide you through something if you need to be guided very, very quickly. And the other thing that I think is important is to step back and see where the fatalities have occurred as well. So if we step back and assess it, what you're going to find is most of it is tied somehow to power haulage. So again, when you start thinking about the training, and I think that's such a great point that he made, it's not just the new hires, but the new hires who are going to be where? Are they in a haul truck? Are they in a loader? What age is the loader? What type of fire suppression is on the piece of equipment? They're just a series of questions that you need to be asking yourselves as you go through that process. And I do think if ever there was an area in which process matters, it really is in safety. I mean, let's face it, so many times when we've seen incidents, they're driven by somebody trying to do something actually that's altruistic. So here's what I mean. Somebody sees something that needs to be done. It's a busy day. They're trying to do the right thing, and instead of going and getting some help, instead of getting somebody else to pick up the other end of whatever that heavy object is they're about to lift, well, I can do it. It'll just take a second. I'm going to slow somebody else down. And they pick it up, and they injure themselves that quickly. And part of what we talk to people about is make the right, smart decision. Get some help, look at it, actually slam what you're about to do, and make sure you really go through and think about it. So coming back after incidents and really doing a risk assessment on the how and what, and then talking about that with your broader operating team weekly, bi-monthly, or otherwise, makes a big difference. And we have division presidents who lead those calls. So they're seeing the example set by people who have very responsible, big jobs in our company. The other thing that happens in ours, if MSHA comes through and does an inspection and we have 10 or more citations, they give me a call. They, meaning the plant manager. or the operations manager and I have a phone call. I personally don't think that's punishment. I don't think they ought to be happy to have a chat with me, but for whatever reason, they're not thinking that's a particularly coveted call to make. And the fact is, I think it actually does what you would think, and that is people are really prepared when they think these inspections, or they're prepared, period, but they know they're going to have inspections 2 or 4 times a year at the underground operations. And I think, again, the notion of driving behaviors makes all the difference. And I think if we can control the incidents, we can control the fatalities. And that's why we need to look at the tip of the iceberg.
We definitely reward our people off of citations per inspection, and that does matter. And I think Scott mentioned earlier another thing that I think just when you have a good, clean site, it just correlates to the whole operation working better. There's less of everything that goes wrong when you have a nice, tidy site. So I think that's kind of where it starts, and you get a plant manager that really buys into that, you're going to have a good, safe operation too.
Absolutely. Sticking with safety and kind of, MSHA's obviously been brought up a couple of times. I'm curious with Chris Williamson now in with MSHA, and I know this is something that kind of varies by administration, but I'm just curious what, maybe changes or differences you've seen since Chris Williamson has stepped in at MSHA, if there's been any increases in any facets or any notable changes that you'd like to share.
Yeah, I haven't seen that big a change since he's gone in as administrator. The biggest change that I saw was when we started having more coal inspectors coming through aggregate operations, because they're actually very different businesses. And I think it took a while for coal inspectors and aggregate businesses and vice versa to get to know each other and understand what to expect. The fact is the Mine Act is the Mine Act. And what I don't want to do is put ourselves in a position that we enable them to write good paper. At the end of the day, I think Kirk said it really well. If we have people who are going through the operations are clean, if they're neat, if they're orderly, and people are looking for pinch points, and they're identifying things as easily as fire extinguishers and when they were last checked or refreshed. It's little things like that that can make a big difference. But I haven't, it's an agency, it's an enforcement agency. They're going to write tickets, and that's, in many respects, what they're there for. I would like to see them think of themselves increasingly as a resource and not as much as a police force. At the same time, the code does exist, and they're going to enforce the code.
I think the main thing I would personally like to see, and from what I hear, is just a subjectivity that still exists within the ticket writing from one organization to the next, or from site to site, or from inspector to inspector. And he says a coal inspector comes in, they're looking for something entirely different than the last inspector. And I think, in my opinion, it would be nice to have a little bit more consistency within the agency so we know what exactly it is that we need to be doing instead of writing a ticket for a bunch of nonsense.
Yeah, just from my perspective, Jack, I haven't really seen an uptick in intensity. I think it kind of comes and goes in cycles for us. One thing I do notice, though, is my managers that have that tone of where they're really wanting to better their site, I feel like the inspector picks up on that. And it does create some leniency as well. When they see that you're trying to make an effort to make your site safer, and you come across that way, there's no doubt, I think that makes an impact on your inspection.
Absolutely. Looking now at kind of a bit of a local issue, or something that's going on here in Missouri, is the levels of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, and sort of some of the issues that's causing, and with barge traffic and everything going on there. So I'm curious, Kirk, maybe leading off with you, I'm curious to what extent, if you do you utilize either of these rivers to ship material, and are you experiencing any issues there?
A lot of issues, yeah. We dredge all our sand on the Missouri River. You know, last winter, we had barges sitting on the on the floor of the river. It's about to happen again. You know, we're light loading barges on the Mississippi. We ran out of cement in Memphis. It's not fun. You know, it's costly. We can see it month to month. You can't get away from it. So it's just a natural thing, and we're hoping it cycles through, and it'll probably flood next year. So it's a challenging environment. It's not more challenging than the rail, I'm sure, but it's still challenging nonetheless.
Yeah, well, I tell you, my region actually, we don't ship down the Mississippi, and so not affected by that. However, Summit does have 2 cement plants up on the northern end of the Mississippi, and I do know they're just what Kirk said. They're doing a lot of light loading. Quantities are tight, especially when they get downriver, and it's a tough situation. I know their Continental Cement's the name of the business, and I know the team is working very hard on logistics to try to navigate and get the customers the materials they need.
You know what, it's a liquid highway, and we actually had a very significant business on the Mississippi River some years ago. We actually did a very large asset swap, in fact the largest in the industry's history, and we traded a business we had up and down the Mississippi for a business that Lafarge had in Colorado, so that took us largely off the liquid highway.
You know, not just looking at the Missouri, Mississippi rivers, or as you call them, liquid highways, Ward, you know, with some of the issues like you mentioned, Kirk, in rail, barges, shipping ports, a lot of the backup that's causing some of these supply chain and lead time issues. What do you think the future looks like for transportation of aggregates as some of these problems persist or possibly subside?
I don't have a good answer for that. I'm just going to deal with it.
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting watching several things. One, most aggregates, 70+% of them move by truck. And if we think about what a governor to growth has been over the past year, 2 years, it's been finding truck drivers. I mean, we've all seen that, whether we employ them ourselves or our customers do. Finding adequate truck drivers has been a challenge. And the railroads have struggled the last few years. At Martin Marietta, we'll send 30 million tons a year by rail. So we will ship on BN, UP, Kansas City Southern, CSX, and NS. So we see all Class 1 railroads in the United States. In varying degrees, they've looked at their business model and tweaked it at times over the last few years, really looking at what was called precision railroading in Canada, brought into the United States in varying degrees. In some places it worked, and others it hasn't. And I think the railroads themselves right now, from a logistics perspective, are looking at that and sorting out how to best address the labor issues they have, many of which are obviously in the news today for a lot of reasons, and the power issues that they have as well. So they've got people issues, they've got locomotive issues, and then they're also looking for people who can be very thoughtful in the partnering with them. And what that means, and I get it, is how quickly can you load cars at a quarry? How quickly can you offload cars at a rail, at a yard? And how quickly can they go from a producing source to a drop-off source? Because so much of the United States that's in coastal areas simply does not have indigenous stone that's there. So if you go to Houston, there are a lot of people in Houston. There's a lot of sand in Houston. There's no coarse rock in Houston. You see coarse rock in Houston, remember it came from someplace else. So the way that we think about logistics as a nation, and the way that we're going to use boats, and the way we're going to use barges, and the way that we're going to use rail, if we're back to this notion of building communities and the fact that you can't make concrete without crushed stone, you can't make hot mix without crushed stone, how it gets there is going to matter. And because the other thing that we have to keep in mind, it doesn't take a lot of haulage for the haulage to be more impactful financially to the buyer than the product is itself. So it's a key issue for us to keep top of mind.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, Jack, is I think we've got to, on us, it requires more planning. I think we've got to be thoughtful about it. And, you know, we got an off-season coming up. Maybe there's things that can be hauled and take advantage of the off-season when there is capacity. I think we're just going to have to get more creative because it's going to take a lot of agility. There's not enough slack, obviously, in the logistics right now, and it's going to take time for that that industry to respond to it.
I know we just have a few minutes left here, and I know we've covered a lot, sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly of what this year and some past years have brought us. So just to kind of wrap before we get some questions from the crowd, I'm curious, with everything that we've talked about, all of the lingering economic issues, the workforce shortages, the IIJA money coming in, sort of everything that's at play, what is your outlook for 2023 moving forward? Is there optimism? Is there concern? What are you guys feeling heading into a new year?
Lead us off.
All right. Going into 2023, a lot of uncertainty, but I tell you, I'm pretty excited about the opportunity that lies ahead for us. We talked about the public funding. I feel like our pricing principles are really taking effect, and we got momentum on that side of it. So where Kirk started out with inflation was kind of beating us out of the gate, and we couldn't, we're playing catch up. I feel like we're catching up, and we're going to see the benefits of that momentum into 23. So I'm excited on that piece of it. The other piece is on operational excellence. Summit's really big on standing up these centers of excellence. They're really helping our teams out there in the field find those continuous improvement projects where we're driving out cost in our business. And then the last piece for us would be portfolio optimization. We've went through our portfolio, we've found strategic partners, and we've sold off some of our portfolio, which has really strengthened our balance sheet. We've got a lot of capital in the account where we can really look for those acquisition opportunities that may come up in 23 if times get tough, especially. So pretty excited about 23 and the position we're in and where we're going.
Excellent. You know what, I'm optimistic about the coming year, and I think with good reason. We've got a highway bill like we've never had before. We've got a country that is shockingly underbuilt. I mean, if we're sitting here thinking about what our problems are, we've got pretty high-class problems as problems go. Look, if our biggest issues are we're going to need to find more people to come to work for us, and we're going to need to find ways that we can get product to market. There are a lot of people that would love to have the issues that we're confronted with right now. And look, it goes back to part of what we said. This is a great industry filled with great people who are working hard every day to be self-improving. And if we think how far this industry has come over the course of 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and 25 years, it really is striking. And I truly believe this industry's best days are ahead of it, and I think we will enjoy those very much. And I think the more that we can continue to bring the quality of people into this industry that are in this room, we will all benefit for generations from that.
I echo their sentiment. I think the near term could be a little bumpy, right? I think everybody feels that way, but the long-term fundamentals are great, and this is a great industry to be in. And I think more and more people are starting to realize that too. But I would say 23 overall, we should beat inflation, but that's a difficult thing to gauge. But we just got to focus on doing the best job that we can and operational excellence, and we're going to be all right.
Absolutely. Excellent. So I think I can't
Okay, we've got time for about 5-10 minutes of questions. Great panel discussion so far. If you have a question, just come right up here, and you can use this microphone. Give the panelists an idea of how popular this event is. This is the most MLPA members I've seen in one place without golf clubs involved. So thank you for joining us.
Golf clubs or a drink, I'm thinking. Yeah.
That's accurate. Buck, do you have a question? No, thank you. Not a crowd that's big on public speaking. If no one has any questions, that's fine. That'll keep us on track with our schedule. I'd like to ask the panelists to stand up so our volunteer photographer can get a good shot of you. So please stand and come to the board, and let's have a round of applause for our panelists coming today.
Thank you, Ward. Thank you so much.